Friends, peace be with you. We shall look at the recent state elections in Malaysia and its implications. The title of the talk would be State Elections in Malaysia, Victories and Defeat. The recent state elections held on the 12th of August 2023 has brought to the fore three questions. What are the three questions? Number one, what explains UMNO's debacle? Number two, what explains PAS's growing strength and influence? Number three, what explains the DAP's huge triumph? I shall begin with the first question, UMNO's debacle. The main reason, the main cause of UMNO's debacle is the corruption amongst its elite. This is something which some of our newspapers and the media as a whole has talked about, and it is something that a lot of people are aware of. A number of surveys done amongst ordinary people, ordinary Malays, show very clearly that corruption is the factor, more than anything else, that has brought about UMNO's downfall. Now, corruption and its impact upon elections, upon UMNO's political power, became obvious in the 2018 general elections, the 14th general election. Before that, it was not that obvious, but 2018 it became very obvious because the major issue in that election, which led to UMNO's decline, was 1MDB. In that general election, 1MDB. That was the focus. And UMNO had no way of defending itself. The people were angry, they were unhappy, they knew what had happened, and it was reflected in the ballot box. In some ways, what had happened in the 1MDB scandal was unique, even against the background of UMNO and corruption. Why was it unique? It was perhaps the first major corruption scandal in the history of the country and in the history of UMNO that implicated the serving president of the party, the current prime minister at that time, the person who was prime minister at that time. It was the first corruption scandal of that sort. And in addition to his role, it was a scandal that brought to the fore the role of his wife, Dato Sri Rosma. So Najib and Rosma, these two names came to the fore. And if you look at how UMNO fared in the election, compared to the 2013 election that was held before the 2018 election, 2013 election, UMNO won 88 seats. But in the 2018 election, it managed to keep only 54 parliamentary seats. It was clear that UMNO was declining rapidly. And then, a few years later, 2022, the 15th general election, UMNO won only 26 seats, further decline. Very obvious. And again, it's corruption. That was the main reason. The UMNO was sinking, except that the top leadership did not want to recognize this. At that time, it was no longer Najib, it was Zaid Hamidi who was at the helm. And he just did not want to come to terms with this reality. And Zahid, he not only was in denial, he took action against UMNO leaders who questioned him. Some were suspended and some were expelled from the party. So this was Zahid acting tough in a situation where he was the cause of the decline of the party. And that made the situation even worse, what he did. This had an impact upon the electorate without any doubt at all. What happened in 2022. And that impact was felt in the state elections that were held on the 12th of August 2023, this year. If you look at the state elections, UMNO contested something like 108 state seats right across the board in 6 states, 6 out of 13 states. It won only 19 seats, which was a dismal, disgraceful performance. But the trend was so obvious to almost everyone, except the top leadership in UMNO, that people were unhappy, they were angry, they did not accept what was, to their minds, the biggest mishap that had befallen the party, the corruption of its elite, of its top leaders. Whether they would make amends, whether there'd be changes, that's something else, and it's beyond the scope of our discussion this evening. Now, corruption was a major factor in the recent state elections that explains UMNO's decline. But there was something else, the rising cost of living, unemployment, especially amongst youths, unemployment, but basically a lackluster economy which impacted upon the people. And that should also be included as a very important factor. Within that, of course, the rising cost of living, which in some ways is a global phenomenon, but in Malaysia, it is something that had an impact upon the recent elections. Now, socioeconomic grievances linked with the economy, with the societal fabric. Now, those grievances express themselves through ethnic politics, to politics associated with a political party which saw itself as a champion of Islam, the faith of the majority community in the country. And this is what happened. PAS benefited from these socioeconomic grievances which were channelized, which found expression through an ethno-religious political party. This is something we have to understand. that what gives a certain emotional power to socioeconomic grievances in competitive politics, in electoral systems like ours and others, it's the nexus between socioeconomic grievances and identity politics. It is something that we must understand. This played itself out in the state elections. It was there in the 2022 general elections too, but it was most clearly manifested in the state elections. So there was corruption and this nexus between socioeconomic grievances and identity politics. And that impacted heavily upon UMNO. The other reason why UMNO suffered at the polls. And of course, at a more specific level, in a more concrete way, personalities with no credibility at the helm of the party and so on. This made it even worse. So that explains UMNO's debacle. More than some of the arguments some people have made that it's because the Malay psyche has changed and all the rest of it, no. The real reasons are corruption and the nexus between socioeconomic grievances, which have become rampant, which were widespread, socioeconomic grievances, and the power of an ethno-religious party, which is able to mobilize those grievances but channelize them through ethnicity and religion. Let me turn to the second question now. PAS's growing influence and popularity. Now, what I said about UMNO just now, why the debacle had taken place. Number one, corruption was the reason why PAS did well. So you see, you cannot separate the two political parties because this has expressed itself at other times in our history, where because of UMNO's failure, PAS gains. And vice versa in some instances where PAS doesn't do well and then UMNO gains. So this is one factor. Another factor would of course be the socioeconomic grievances that we talked about, and in particular the dimension socioeconomic grievances linked to ethnic and religious concerns that helped PAS a great deal because it was seen as the party which stood for a certain view of ethnicity and religion in the country. In addition to that, one is to argue that PAS did well, partly because over the last 20-25 years, Islamic consciousness of a type, and I emphasize of a type because I'm not sure whether it really represents the essence of Islam, but Islamic consciousness of a type linked to forms and rituals and certain notions of what Islam is, they've become stronger and stronger in the country. And they've impacted in certain areas. You have in business and enterprises, for instance, now you have this notion of being Sharia compliant. And it is in other areas too, wanting to be Sharia compliant. And then you have religious schools, Tafiz schools sprouting all over the place, a proliferation of these schools. And of course, we've had from the 70s onwards women using the hijab and, people trying to be Islamic, So it is a phenomenon, there's no doubt about it at all. And it's another factor that one has to consider. Rising Islamic consciousness, which has impacted upon the electoral system and Malaysian politics. And to all this, I would add something else, which people should perhaps come to terms with. I think PAS has also learned through its politics, its experience, that the way to garner support, to mobilize support, is to sort of establish a link between religious personalities in the party and the so called technocrats. They know that this is a winning formula. Link religious personages with the so called technocrats. And the best example of this in the recent state elections was the clean sweep that PAS achieved in Terengganu, where at the helm was that sort of leadership, religious leadership and technocracy, if you like. A person who was a technocrat, at the same time an engineer. And PAS knows this is the winning combination. This is why they're changing the leadership in Kelantan now. They're going to again emphasize this link. Religious personality, piety, in other words, and ability, technocratic ability, professional ability. Yeah? So this is the dimension that is now emerging as far as PAS is concerned. So it's quite a formidable formula. Now that explains PAS's strength and its success. And it is something which will be with us for some time to come, if you look at the underlying forces and factors at work. Let me now turn to the last question, the DAP's huge triumph. The DAP, since the 60s, since it succeeded the PAP in the mid-60s, has always been a spokesman of non-Malay interests, non-Malay grievances. This is how it has mobilized support, and this is how it has presented itself, and this was undoubtedly a factor. It has played that card effectively for a number of elections, and they did it again in the recent state elections, in the parliamentary elections last year, and in every election, as the spokesperson, the articulator, the champion of non-Malay interests and grievances, and all the rest of it. Now, when we come to grips with this argument about non-Malay interests and non-Malay grievances, there is a certain way in which the DAP presents these grievances, and that has been a very important factor. Because, the MCA and the MIC, both associated with UMNO and Barisan Nasional, and today Alliance in the past, also see themselves as parties that represent non-Malay interests. But there is a certain way in which the DAP presents these grievances, which has been very, very effective. And we have to try to understand this. The DAP has always argued that these grievances show that the non-Malays are second-class citizens in this country, that this country is a country that is dominated by Malay interests, the Malays who have everything in this country, that the others are marginalized, the others are sidelined. This has been the rhetoric that the DAP has promoted all along. It is very effective rhetoric when you present it in such blatant, stark communal terms. I say it is blatant, it's stark, because if you look at the total reality, the entire landscape, it is not correct. It is not correct to say that the non-Malays are totally marginalized, or that they are subjugated, that they are the victims of oppression and all the rest of it. Anyone who knows Malaysia would realize that if you did an economic profile of the country, you'll find that segments of the Chinese community, and mind you, segments, not the entire community, but the segments of the Chinese community, they've done well. And that would be true of the middle and upper class within the Indian community too. They've done well. The Indian poor, that's a different story. But as far as the upper echelons of these two communities are concerned, they've done well in the economy. They're well entrenched, they have a strong position in the economy. If you look at the cultural scene, the cultural landscape of the country, how can you say that the Chinese as a cultural community are marginalized? Their language is used very widely in business and enterprise in this country, and the Chinese language is promoted through Chinese newspapers, the media. There is a Chinese language education stream in this country, primary school, secondary school. You have the Chinese language being used very widely. And as far as education is concerned, the existence of Chinese primary schools in this country and Chinese secondary schools, it is something quite unique actually. Because if you look at nearly every other post colonial society, we've had communities, Chinese in particular, coming from outside, settling down in a particular geographical area, becoming part of that country, part of that country's tapestry. You find that there's never been this sort of independent Chinese school system that has been so very powerful. It's not just this educational system in itself, it is a vested interest, the way it is defended in politics, the way it is portrayed and projected in politics. This is something one has to understand. At the root of it is the exaggeration, the distortion of certain grievances, some of which are legitimate without any doubt at all, and I've often written and spoken about some of these grievances in the past, but it is the distortion and the perversion associated with the articulation of these grievances which is a problem. It is what complicates the ethnic situation. It is what creates a huge chasm between Malays and non-Malays in ethnic relations. The reason why the DAP has been regarded in certain ways by quite a lot of Malays, and it's not just Malays in UMNO, generally quite a lot of Malays, they have a certain perception of the DAP. It's largely because of the way the DAP articulates Chinese grievances, where there's this notion of oppression, discrimination, marginalization, taken to its extreme, without any understanding of the larger situation, without telling the truth, as it were. And this is another factor that one has to keep in mind, which explains the DAP's strength and its power. And that brings me to the conclusion. I think in a multi-ethnic society like ours, the first condition, the first principle of politics is one has to be honest. Look at the facts, tell the truth. You don't have to distort, you don't have to lie. It's dangerous. It's dangerous in any society, but it's particularly dangerous in a multi-ethnic society because of the way in which grievances create huge chasms between communities. And true, the DAP does this, pass in a sense, which also did well in the recent state elections, also does the same thing. The way in which they present Malay grievances, for instance, or grievances pertaining to Islam, there's a lot of distortion. You're not looking at the real situation. If you give the impression, for instance, that the Malays are in danger of being wiped out, of being marginalized in their own country and all the rest of it, that's a distortion. And why is that distortion pervasive? Because it brings votes. And PAS has played that game, which is not right. And I'm not saying that the ruling coalition is free of such sins. They too play this game, but in a different way and for different purposes. But they too play this game relating to ethnic realities. In other words, not telling the truth, distorting, and so on. Take a simple example. If people go on saying, and some UMNO leaders have done this, we won't mention names, that all Chinese are well to do in this country. All Malays, you know, are victims of Chinese power, that they don't have any status in this country and so on. This is a total lie, because we look at the reality, it's different. And this is why we very often argue that you must come to grips with realities and you must tell the truth as far as politics is concerned. All parties have done this. So this would be the first thing that we should change if we want to have better ethnic relations, rather than just talk about, which party can work with which party and so on, which are all important, yes, but the important thing is the truth about politics itself and about the economy, about the situation of the country. And at the same time, I think it is so important that while we come to grips with these realities, we also try to represent everyone. And we represent everyone in an inclusive, in a universal manner, without trying to be a champion of one group against another. There are times when you have to talk about certain ethnic issues and so on, but the moment you project yourself as a champion of one group against another, whether it is Malays against non-Malays or non-Malays against Malays, then I think you're doing a terrible disservice to the country. And this is what has become pervasive in this country, that the ethnic game has reached a new pitch. It has become far more dangerous than it was in the past. Why? Because ethnic political parties now dominate. The political coalition, the sort of arrangement in the past which had its weaknesses, that was able to hold the middle ground, is not there anymore. The middle ground has disappeared. Instead, what you have are dominant forces that speak on behalf of one or the other, one community or the other. And this is not good for our society. We have to overcome this. We have to develop a new ethos. We have to create a new milieu. And how we can do it and how we can work towards this, all of us, Malaysians and the younger generation in particular, that would be the topic of another discussion in the future. Thank you.